Let us mostly begin. So I'm in an unusual position because I'm the Chief Academic Officer at a university whose president, as recently as 3 years ago, I think said quite correctly, Houston Baptist University isn't going to do online education. And in the last 2 years, in one aspect of going online, our entire core, general education, will be online by the end of this year, and at least 3 graduate programs are fully online as of this fall. Well, was that contradictory? Did our visionary president finally have to succumb to the evils of the internet? I think the answer to that is no. I think what was true was that there was a version of online education that he surely wasn't going to do, and we are not doing. And then there's a version of online education that everyone already does. By which I mean, I view online as a tool not dissimilar to a typewriter. The weird thing about online or computers is that we've treated them in an almost mystic manner. Let me give you an example. It's often said about millennials that they are very good at technology or they're native to technology. In fact, as far as I can tell, both from research and the students I actually still teach, what they are users of technology. So to say they're savvy with technology is roughly akin to saying I'm savvy about my car. I used a car to get here. I know how to drive the car. I'm not even necessarily very good at driving the car. Notice if you ask most people, are you an average or below average driver? People remarkably think they're all average to above average. Now clearly in the population, half the people are below average, whatever the skill level is, even if we're all as great at driving as race car drivers, people are worse in that category too. My suggestion is that in fact, I'm not a savvy car owner. I know very little about how it works. I could tell you very little about what's going on, and I actually use very few of the features most of the time. I'm not even sure I'm aware of all of them. In fact, the more features that they can make automatic, the more they've made them automatic. Because as cars have become ubiquitous, the less we actually understand about how to use cars. All I can describe this as my grandfather, who was introduced to automobiles, could do almost everything with a Model A. It was an exceedingly simple device, and if he had to rebuild it on the road, he could almost do it. He knew how to handle his car. As a user, I'm much less savvy about my automobile, but I don't think about it. It's just there. So I'd like to suggest to you that when it comes to technology, our current students may actually be less savvy than you are. You may be able to think about technology and get under the hood more than they can because they grow up in a technological era where if you can't push the button and it works nearly immediately, it's just frustrating and I'm not going to do it anymore. Now, I'm old enough that I taught the first class I ever taught online on a Commodore 64. A device so old that most of you will have to Google it. It had 32K of accessible memory, and I was teaching a class over a 1200 baud modem where I could watch the questions letter by letter come up onto the screen. It was so slow I had to anticipate the question and try to answer it before it was finished, often leading to bizarre miscommunications occurring in this kind of virtual classroom. And this was pre-internet, at least pre-internet in the sense that someone like I could use it. We were on a network called Q-Link. It was like a proprietary, it was a forerunner actually to America Online, AOL. When they moved from a Commodore platform, they became what was then called an IBM compatible platform, a Windows platform, what became a Windows platform, and became AOL. So I actually had to understand all those technologies. I had to get under the hood in order to teach. And at this point, we're dealing with a student population that just takes computers serious just as part of nature. Like typewriters were when I was a young adult. When you were hired to be an admin or you went to work in a college, they didn't buy you a typewriter. Because if you were an academic, you got your own typewriter. I think an example of how old-fashioned we've become about technology is that most colleges and universities still buy their faculty computers and replace them on a cycle. That means most of their faculty are using antiquated computers by the end of the cycle. You know, my university doesn't buy me a car. They expect me to get to work as part of the pay they give me. In the same way, they don't buy me a cell phone. But I looked around our university recently, and most of my faculty own a more powerful cell phone in terms of processor than they own a computer, because we haven't been able to keep up with the replacement cycle. Now, this can be solved by bring your own device, and I don't want to get into that. The deeper point is just this. Technology needs to be part of our rethink, not itself drive our rethink. Any more than when typewriters came in, people didn't pause. We're overly enamored, in other words, with the technology. They didn't pause and say, well, this is going to make everything new. So in one way, I'm going to suggest that the change is less grand than it's sometimes made out to be. In another way, I'm going to tell you that everything is about to change. So my job as a philosopher and as an administrator, we've had to think about this at a big flyover level, but we've also had to institute change that affected faculty in their daily lives. 2 years ago, nobody at HBU was teaching online except in a kind of flipped banner-based system. Now, it's expected of all the faculty at HBU. So that process we can talk about and what that means and where I think things are going. I think we're at a tipping point in terms of technology, the good news being that we're no longer in a position where we need to be enamored with technology. When my legally blind father is getting all of his news, he's 76 years old, off a Kindle, using the Amazon kind of ecosystem, emailing and using Facebook. We're really past the point where we should be thinking about technology as new or as exciting or as revolutionary. And it's actually a sign of kind of the stagnation of education, since it's mostly a government enterprise. Whether we're talking about higher education or public education, let's recall that most people are involved in what amounts to a socialistic system, which means we have adapted very, very slowly to technology. Regular people have adapted, if they had the funds, very, very quickly. They've changed their patterns of behavior. And I'm going to suggest that most of what we talk about in terms of educational technology is putting old wineskins to the task of holding new wine, and it's overly dramatic, so we're going to waste money. Do you see the tension? There's a possibility that we'll become so enamored with technology that we'll do what a lot of schools do and buy everyone in the school an iPad. And I recently visited a school like that, and I was getting ready to lecture, and they were paying me to be there to give a lecture. And before I could give a lecture, they took roll using a check system of every student. Now let's pause and think. Every student in the room had an iPad with them. They had to. All of which could have located them in the room. When I suggested this at the beginning of the lecture, they said, well, how do we know somebody didn't bring someone else's iPad? That's a good question. Except, how do you know someone didn't say here for another student? They said, well, that's harder to pull off. And I said, no, I did it all the way through your taking roll. There were several students missing. And if there was a long enough pause, I was sitting to the side and I simply said, here. And they checked the box. Because they were reading through a long list of names. Now, my point isn't to put that school down. It's simply to say they got enamored with technology, they brought it in, but they didn't actually think through what they were going to do with it. And so it was just a waste. That's where I would suggest technology becomes a gimmick, and why we all become kind of skeptical about it. Oh, people like Reynolds come and say apocalyptic things about the nature of education, and nothing really changes. Well, of course it doesn't really change because the deeper system hasn't changed. You're dealing with a non-digital, what we might think of as an analog system, because it was designed essentially right after the Second World War, and we're trying to place a digital set of technologies on top of it, and of course it doesn't work. So here's my opening question for you. Would we have designed K through 12 or college education the way it is right now, kind of standard model, if we had had in 1945, when government money got involved, access to the computer technology that we have today? Let me pause and just see what people have to say about that. So in 1945, government money got involved in higher education, and by higher education I include high school. Remember, for 400 years, Reynoldses from Jamestown forward lived in the United States, and we never went past 8th grade. Ever. For 400 years. After my dad's generation, my dad was the first Reynolds to go to high school, and he went from high school to college to grad school as a post-World War II kid. Mostly because a lot of money was poured into places like West Virginia to enable it. Now, outside of me, I'm in higher education. No Reynolds in my line is doing a job any different than Reynoldses did for 400 years beforehand. In other words, if you're going to leave college and become, it's a good job, a life insurance salesperson, could you have done that prior to 1945? Yes. Have things changed in the life insurance industry? Of course they have. But I got licensed to sell life insurance in New York State. And I essentially, to pass that very rigorous exam, one of the most rigorous exams I've ever taken, much harder than the GRE, I had to use information, most of which I had mastered by 8th grade. Could I read well, write well, think well, memorize huge amounts of data, and spew them forth? Could I be mentored by another life insurance salesperson at Metropolitan and learn to do the job? Yes, I could. So the real question is, why did we do what we did? Well, partly we did what we did to keep the Great Depression from happening again. As millions of soldiers demobbed, by sending them to school, we guaranteed that they wouldn't flood into the workplace. Secondly, there were certain kinds of jobs like engineering and nursing that we moved over to universities that we didn't have to have moved over to universities. We could have set up apprenticeship models for task-based majors. We didn't because the government wanted to control how its money was spent. And let's recall that we're at places like Biola and Houston Baptist University, the vast majority of college students go to giant state-run institutions. The Cal State system, the UC system, the University of Texas system, Texas, community colleges all across the state of Texas. This is education is essentially a government-run business. And so to guide taxpayer money, universities became excellent places to produce more engineers as opposed to the private sector where we would have had to give it to startup companies and who knows what they would have done with it. Money bred money, bred money, bred money. And after all, isn't education awesome? Well, maybe. But let me pause and go back to the original question I asked. If in 1945, they had the ability to track, right down to keystrokes, what every single American did. And we hope the NSA isn't tracking this lecture right now, though they probably are, right, for kind of keywords. I'll try to use all of them during this lecture so that, when the end comes, they'll kill me first. It's the goal of every worshiper of Cthulhu. If you worship Cthulhu adequately, he will eat you first when he comes, and so you won't have to suffer like the people who don't follow him. I figure if I offend the government enough, it will kill me first, and that will be good. So the question is, what about school? K through 16 would be different if we were rebooting today, recalling that most people didn't go to the last 8 years of school in the United States.
It'd be a lot more customized somehow. I'm not sure how.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's the kind of thing I have to think about every day. Now, I realize most of us aren't in a position to make revolutionary change, and I'm not going to advocate that. That would break whatever institution you work at. But I am saying this change will inevitably come, even to socialized systems. In other words, 1945 paradigms can't go on forever. The change will come. If you're at a private institution and you're nimble enough and you get ahead of the change, you may actually be able to reorder where you are. I mean, it's nice to be able to be at Biola from HBU, and one reason I went to HBU is the two schools don't compete for students. 98% of our students are drawn from Houston and from Texas. Texas students don't leave Texas. Just like the vast majority of Biola's students come from the West Coast, though draw a little more nationally than a smaller school like HBU does. But what's the point? We could try to catch up with USC, local school here, or Rice, which is my main, big rich school next door, for 100 years, 200 years. And unless somebody gives us billions of dollars to put in our endowments, we're not going to catch up under the old rules. Any more than if you start a film company under the old studio system, you were likely to catch up with Paramount. But when the rules change at a deep level, some big places will use money to keep up, like Microsoft did when they missed the internet and threw money at it to catch up. Though they never quite did, right? They never quite did, even with all that cash. So some schools would survive, but then other nimble people will step into the ecosystem. Places like Biola have an opportunity. But even the great state structures will eventually have to change or die because they will deserve to. But I agree, it will be more individualized somehow because we can now track what each student does almost to the point of evil. And that was just not possible in 1945. You had to make things standardized because it was the only way to guarantee we weren't totally ripping you off. Now remember, that's just a return to the Oxbridge model. Before schools had to deal with so many people, educate so many people, you essentially had an individualized education program because there were so few students and they were all rich, elite white men in places like Britain. So it was easy to standardize because the worker-student ratio was so low and the people were so much the same. They came from similar backgrounds. It's not a good thing, it's just that's the way it was. Any other comments? How would schools change? Even, let's say, 9 through 12 schools. I mean, why do we have 9 through 12 education? Seriously. What's the good of high school, especially traditional high school? Why does it exist?
To keep them out of trouble and babysit them so they can drive.
Yes. My suggestion is, I get that a lot, and my suggestion is that's why high school will change less quickly than college, because it does serve a babysitting function. Of course, we have to remind ourselves that's because the process of staying a kid in our culture has been extended a long ways. My grandfather was, after all, married, built his own house, and was farming at 16. Now, I'm not suggesting we should return to that culture, but I do know this: he was capable of doing it and died as a successful, happy man. Now, again, we don't want to be revolutionary. People who, run off and say, oh, that's what we should do, move to Idaho, and start trying to do that sort of thing, cause more harm. That's why I'm a conservative, right? Conservatives say even bad systems need to be changed slowly or you'll do more harm than good. Why didn't Christianity abolish slavery immediately in the Roman Empire? For the reason that evolving out of slavery would harm fewer people, including slaves, in the long term. They made slavery impossible to sustain as an economically viable force. Go read Philemon. You got to treat your slave as a friend and brother. Onesimus and Philemon. Well, if you end up actually doing that, is that slavery or are you just working for the person? I mean, who's in charge? I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, a question about 9 through 12. They call it college prep.
Yes.
So under the government system, that would just feed right into.
Yeah, I hate to tell you this, but whether it's at Biola where I taught for 17 years or HBU where I've now been for 2, when I talk to students about why they're at college, overwhelmingly what I'm told is to get a good job. Now notice that in many majors, our premier program is probably nursing and pre-med in a place like Houston. It's accidental that colleges picked up those skills. They could have been retained by hospitals as nursing education was done prior to the Second World War overwhelmingly. When my aunt became a nurse in the generation right after World War II, she still mostly went to a teaching hospital, got her certification as an RN, and began practicing the first day she walked in. It was more or less going from being a candy striper to an RN in a series of learning on the job type merit-based education. She earned while she learned. We could have chosen to go in that direction. I'm not saying we should have, but you can see why we didn't. We needed centralized systems. For example, the library that sits over here is probably one of the last conventional libraries to ever have been constructed. As we look at replacing our antiquated library at HBU, a real option is to get rid of the library altogether. We probably won't do that, but it's as much because people expect us to have one as anything else. Like, there have to be some stacks for them to look at. It's kind of like advertising. It's an aesthetic thing. How many students use the stacks? You don't want to know the answer to that. And it isn't because they're stupid, ignorant, or writing bad papers. So yeah, there's some truth to that. Now notice none of the reasons we've been given for sending kids to high school are actually have anything to do with education so far. Or they're self-perpetuating. So the second thing my students say to me is, to get a good job, we already saw that in most cases that wasn't necessary. Service-oriented jobs that they're actually going to get in the real world, if they're a general college student, don't require college education. Go look at the research. Everyone says, oh, I'm teaching critical thinking. Do studies show that students who go to college retain the critical thinking that they had at 22 when they're 42? Go check it out for yourself. The last time I checked, the answer was no. No. If you don't use it, you lose it. Just in the same way that I have many adult learners who come back to school who can't read their undergraduate papers. If you ask them to produce the paper they produced at 22, they're incapable of doing it. They didn't retain, we'll teach you to think in a certain way and you'll retain that and that will help you. No, they didn't retain it. We know they didn't retain it because when they come back as adult learners, we have to reteach them to write academic papers because nobody writes them in real life. So notice your argument has to be a bad one. I'm not saying what you said was bad because it's circular. I go to high school so I can go to, but most people we could ask, why do you go to college? To get a good job, or because in my social class it's expected that I went to college, or it's like an idiot test. It's like the game of life, the actual game, if you've ever played it. If you go straight through to business, it's slightly faster, but you make less money the whole way through, just like Steve Jobs. Oh, wait. Up to now, though, unless you became an athlete or a rock star or were weird like Steve Jobs, kind of the safe bet was go to college, get that normal job. But now we have to ask, given technology, is that really what we should be doing? We're a multi-billion-dollar industry. Is that the best expenditure of culture's billions of dollars? Are we efficient? Again, I'm not putting down higher education. I'm saying, do most people actually need it, use it, and want it? If they don't, we're forcing them into a system that makes them unhappy. And it will die unless compelled. If education weren't compulsory, how many people would go? And college amounts to compulsory for certain classes of people. 2 assumptions. Information will be free. I really enjoyed the last presentation I sat through that was in this room because it depended on this assumption. We won't be able to charge for information. That's just excellent. Now, if you're at a private school of any sort, high school or college, the sad truth is the tuition model depends on what? Paying for information to some extent. We've got to get rid of that part of the model. And we can talk about that more specifically when we get to Q&A. The second truth, if you will, is there's a premium in the workplace on general skills. Reading well, writing well, thinking well, and being numerate. I'm sure I've missed a couple of other skills, but let's hold to those. We need to pause and ask ourselves, if we took an 8th grade student who had those general skills and sent them out to live their life, in other words, what every Reynolds did before 1945, how many people would be worse off? If we leave aside the way our culture requires babysitting skills, right? 9th graders aren't ready to go work, so we kind of restrain them from working and getting paid and dealing with real life in schools. How much of the skills that people retain do they know by 8th grade? My suggestion will be that most people that you meet who are my age, I'm 50, have about an 8th grade education because they keep using it. If we can be replaced, we will be. That's the third assumption. Because the system is socialized, it will be slower, this process. If it weren't government controlled, if it were like the food industry or the music industry, this process would be quick. Now, because we're also dealing with education, I think the process should be slow as it can be to keep from harming the individuals involved in higher education, both faculty and current students, and people who carry certificates that might otherwise become useless, that they still might own tens of thousands of dollars in debt in. We should evolve this process as slowly as possible. I will point out, though, that the food industry isn't socialized and that changes occur very rapidly there, some of which harm people and some of which help people. So again, it's kind of accidental that we picked on education to so radically socialize. We could have taken a mostly private model to this, and the change would already have occurred. For bad and good. I'm not talking about utopian futures here, right? Or that free markets are solutions to all our problems. Okay, and here's a problem with every technology and education conference I go to. Teaching is not for its own sake, but for the sake of the rest of life. How many seminars do you go to that center around improving your classroom? Now here's the question. Why in the world do we have classrooms? Let's make school more enjoyable. Let's make school better. Let's make school what? Why does school exist at all? Didn't school originally exist to do what? Prepare you for what students sometimes call real life. Yet for many students, let's leave grad school out of this if you go straight through, they spend 16 years in educational structures that don't plainly prepare them for life as they're going to know it. In other words, if we make school more like what the customers want, and in the case of customers, we're dealing with 6-year-olds to 22-year-olds, we can improve the satisfaction. We might even improve learning outcomes, but we might make students less fit to live in the world that they'll have to enter at the end of education unless they become teachers. Which is why I think sometimes more and more of our best students want to be us, want to be who we are. Because all the candy and gum, all the rewards come from doing well where? In school. How many people do you know that in the first 4 or 5 years out of college face a kind of epistemological and even ontological crisis because it turns out they're very good at school and very bad at anything anyone wants to pay them for. And that the treats are distributed in radically different ways. Now, generally, if you're someone my age, we spend a lot of time thinking, how do we manage millennials? How do we get them to be part of the team? And you can Google right now, you'll find lists like 85 bajillion ways. Or we develop a curmudgeonly, these kids need to get off our grass attitude and mock millennials. The truth is, though, somewhere in between. Nobody's going to pay you for something that's interesting all the time. Even professional sports isn't interesting all the time. You know, a big chunk of the time you're in the gym working out. Or in a hot tub because a trainer has stuck you there because you hurt all over. Trust me, I've had the friends. So if we make things easy and accessible and fun all the time, as much as possible, this is so important we have to make it fun, is sometimes a motivation behind a lot of our changes in education. What does that teach our students about the world they're going to enter? In other words, schools didn't exist in most cultures, at most places, at most times. The very cultures that created schools didn't need them to create schools. Have we created an incestuous environment where we'll use tools that actually undermine 9 through senior education in college to prop up that education? Thoughts about this? These are just assumptions. I'm going to get to the 2 big things that I think are happy about this. But I want you to pause and think, do I always come to these seminars to fix or improve a deeply flawed system? Yes, sir.
Yeah, last night even I was thinking, here's all this advice about how to make the classroom more engaging and how to make it more entertaining almost. And that's hard work for me, first of all, so I'm thinking, oh boy, this is going to be hard. But yeah, part of me wants to say, no, sit here and demonstrate that you can do something hard. You can turn in 22 math assignments over the next semester without me tweeting about it every minute to remind
Yeah, I mean, let's just ask this simple question. If an average American college graduate had to compete with a Eurasian kid who went through the school of hard knocks, but worked themselves up, let's say, as a Tiwala somewhere, actually spoke 3 languages and learned their skills the hard way as they rose up through the ranks. If they have to compete head to head in a global economy, who would you bet on? I would. You know, because you might consider that education as we know it depends on the American imperium. It depends on the fact that the average, I'll pick on my own school, HBU graduate allegedly speaks a second language, but no one believes she does. We depend on the fact that some bilingual person or trilingual person will do our tech support so that we don't have to. But what happens when people say, no, we'll make it ourselves. We'll sell it ourselves. We'll do it ourselves. The same thing that happened to the Roman Empire when the barbarians discovered that they didn't have to work as mercenaries. They simply could take the pay themselves by sacking the city. Now, it's an imperfect analogy, but you get the point. Any other comments about these kind of general assumptions? They seem a little apocalyptic, but I want you to remember, we don't want to bring this change quickly. We do want to step back and realize we live in an artificial structure as K through 16 educators, and that our main task should be, in my opinion, to evolve out of it in ways that are prudent but quick. Because if we don't evolve out of it, my suggestion is we will be forced to evolve out of it through other countries becoming competitive with us, because we waste so much money creating structures that actually don't make people happier or wealthier. They don't achieve either of the goals of education we set out. By happier, I mean human flourishing. I don't mean, whee, everything is awesome. No, it really isn't. Not in one sense of awesome. Okay, I will go on to some more practical tips, but those are sort of the assumptions I'm working under. First tip, there is a higher education. We need to begin to center education on mentoring. Now, the good news about this is, all the research I've seen is that millennials crave mentoring. They crave somebody guiding them. The personal in an impersonal world is going to be ever more important. You know, why go to school? Why not just take MOOCs? Anybody tell me what the great mistake of, hey, MOOCs are going to replace us all. What was the mistake about that? What's the problem with a MOOC? These huge classes. I had one of my faculty in philosophy take a biology MOOC. They passed, they know a lot more about biology. Why isn't that occurring all over the world and putting colleges out of business? What's the problem with a MOOC?
No connection with the teacher.
Yeah, and people don't finish. You know, I want to know about biology, then it gets hard and unpleasant, watching these videos, taking these online quizzes. The reward is down there. The work is all here. There's nobody mentoring me. It's all pain and it's impersonal. If you're going to force someone, here is my educational rule of thumb that comes from, I guess, 31 years of teaching now. Started when I was 20. Education begins in pain and ends in pleasure. Always. There's no way to educate someone avoiding this rule of thumb. You can't, in other words, if you gamify the system, eventually you're going to do what I used to call in games level grinding. Do you know what level grinding is? If you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or a game like that, you start off as a level 1 character. The problem with being a level 1 character is you really can't do very much. All the cool stuff, possessions, spells, magic, boy, you want to be a level 120 character. Then you can really have some fun. Eventually, you get to about, games try to hook you in by making the first 10 levels easier. Eventually, there's a period of time in any game where you're just grinding along, doing the work of being a wizard in Barterra. And until you get there, you're just level grinding. Okay, now I'm level 7, there's some treats, maybe a clip of a film. Now I'm at level 8. I mean, it's kind of like Angry Birds, right? You play through Angry Birds at Christmas, and all you get's a video after like 15 levels. But at some point, I got to the point where I just was level grinding. I was 10 levels away, and I wanted to see that darn video if I got all 3 stars, and so I just finished. At some point, the fun may actually disappear from most games for long stretches of time. Because in most games, if they're anything like real life, to become a 120th level wizard takes a lot of work. You know, a Sims game starts to feel a lot like real life. You know, I want all the cool stuff for my house. Okay, I have to go to work every day. I have to earn money. Any questions about that? So the principle is something like this. The only person that you can trust with pain is a mentor. It's the search for Obi-Wan. No one's going to trust a MOOC to give you pain, an impersonal thing. I can trust an impersonal thing to give me pleasure. I shouldn't, but I can. Because pleasure is pleasurable. Hooray! But when it begins to give me pain, I quit, because how can I trust that this is worth it? If I'm going to suffer, I have to know it's worth it, which means you need trustworthy authorities. Now, the good news for education is all teachers in principle want to be mentors. But here's my suggestion. This means online education or flipped classrooms or any other kind of education that's going to be retained in the future I'm describing will need vastly smaller class sizes, not larger class sizes. So to get back to what Dr. Sloan said, if by online education we mean something like the Liberty University model, which is what it is, and they're doing well at doing what they're doing, I don't think that's education. I think that's credentialing. And for right now it will work because we have to have the credentials. But eventually people will raise their hand and say, why do I need this credential? I never use anything, and I'm jumping through hoops I never use. What's going on? On the other hand, who can't think back to school and remember being mentored by the athletic coach, by the drama coach, by the math teacher who sat with you, and find that an invaluable experience? Who would trade that away? Now notice you didn't have to be bused to a central location to achieve that. So we're going to have to consider some of the practices we do. Do we need all the administrators we have in order to set up a mentoring system for people to get job skills and learn deep life lessons? Probably not as many as we have. Why? Because right now I could, using technology from Houston, locate trained mentors who are trustworthy, do background checks with them, interview them by Skype, and set up a good housekeeping list seal of approval that says, go take a film class with this person. When she certifies you're done, we'll take the credit. See, this couldn't be done before. What was Biola for? What was HBU for? It was to tell you that someone like John Reynolds was okay. And we needed lots of them because geography limited our good housekeeping seal of approval. Does anyone believe that's true anymore? What if we had one university to rule them all? Well, there are dangers to that, but notice it could be done now in ways it couldn't be done before. So we're going to center education on mentoring. What does that mean practically? It means our education is essentially going to be about values. And by values, I don't mean ethics, though ethics will be part of it. Often at a Christian college, if I tell someone, we're going to teach values, they think we're going to teach pro-marriage, why abortion is bad, don't steal, be a good citizen, pay your taxes. Yes, we should do all those things. And in fact, I hope HBU does, and I hope Biola does. But by values in education, I mean something more cultural and more relative. Millennial values, those things they value, that they use to operate their life, may work very well in school that we've created and work very poorly in a competitive world. What are they? Free agent mode. On almost any list of millennial values, what do you find? I don't want to commit to this corporation. It's about my personal brand. Let's just pause and say, okay, good, we'd be cool with that. We know how to handle free agents. The NFL's been dealing with them for a long time. Do teams win that are compilations of free agents? No, whether you're the Packers or anybody else, eventually it has to be about team. Now, usually what balances this out is a cause bigger. You usually hear this language about millennials. They'll work, run through a brick wall for you for a cause bigger than themselves. But notice it's always a cause that what? The free agent selected. Man, I'm really into ending human trafficking, to pick a cause that's difficult to think anyone isn't for. Yay, end human trafficking. Now, the question is, can our corporation, our group of people, should we be doing that? That's a great cause. There are a lot of great causes. Maybe our great cause is making sure people have food to eat at a level they can afford. Well, I'm not into that cause. Tough darts. You see, notice that the individualized values we're talking about, where I find a community of like-minded people online who are non-geographically aligned with me so I don't feel isolated, it's a mistake. to think this is individualistic in an isolated way. Because I can go on Facebook and find people exactly like I am, to the point of, almost fine degrees. They're left-handed. They care about human trafficking. They like the movies I like. They like the books I like. And I can hang with those people virtually. Now the question is, will that turn into a life of human flourishing? Disinterest in the corporate ladder. I've tried to express these in the most positive way. I'm not interested in climbing the corporate ladder. Okay, that can fall very quickly into being a loser. Do you see that? Becoming obsessed with being vice president of your corporation when maybe you should not be is bad. But notice, if we were talking in the 1950s, who thought being obsessed with climbing the corporate ladder was a good thing except for bad people? Climbing the corporate ladder could be another term for, I'm doing a good job in my job for the corporation, so I get rewarded. And finally, the need for constant affirmation. I'm just not sure outside of higher education or education anyone's ever going to do this, including millennial managers. Is there any evidence that millennial managers don't eventually get sick themselves of dealing with people who need constant affirmation? Imagine this. Imagine you ran a college or high school where you taught your students the opposite values, and they entered the workplace. Imagine Biola graduated students who were team members of any team they joined until the day they left. When I went to HBU, I became all about dogs up, blue and orange. And until I leave there, that's my school. I'm part of Team HBU. When I was here at Biola, a lot of you know, I was all about Team Biola. Now, that's why I went to a place, by the way, that wasn't directly competitive, right? I wanted to go far away. I wouldn't have gone to a place like APU because it would have been uncomfortable with the way I had to live my life. Imagine a person who had interest in climbing the corporate ladder but wasn't a jerk. Remember, we're not talking about ethics. Anything that's unethical you shouldn't do. But imagine I got here and said, whatever niche it is, whether it's being janitor or the very top job, that's what I want to go for. And ethically, I should go for the top job if I can. Why? Because there are people without my skills that can fill the job I'm in now. So if I don't climb up to a little higher level, I'm keeping them unemployed. I'm going to find the place that maximizes my talents. And then finally, what if you said, I find my affirmation in Christ, I'll say as a Christian, I find my affirmation for my family and for my community. I'll look for affirmation for my friends. I don't need affirmation at work. I'm going to do my job. Imagine that kind of employee in today's corporate environment. What if we created that kind of person? Or at least a person who would challenge standard values, including the ones I just listed, in the opposite direction. They were adaptable, in other words. These are variable values. Sometimes you need to treat yourself like a free agent. Sometimes you need to be part of the team. Not ethics. What if we trained our students to have subjective values, objective ethics? I want to repeat that. What if we trained our students to have subjective values and objective ethics? Let me give you an example. I have to talk about human sexuality and human sexual ethics a lot. One thing, eventually somebody will raise their hand and say, how can you condemn people to a lifetime of celibacy, usually dealing with gay rights? And I point out that a lot of people in our culture involuntarily are condemned to a lifetime of celibacy in nursing homes. No one likes them, and they won't become evil and do things everyone agrees are wrong in order to get some. Are those people condemned to a life of misery? No, they need adaptable what? Values. They don't have to shift their ethics. They're going to have to say what? Well, here's a thing I value, but it's not for me, I guess. So as painful as this is, I'm going to have to value something else. Notice that's not easy to do, but it's not like valuing drinking. You have to have water to live. All of these values can shift all the time. What if you discover you're never going to be corporate vice president, and that's what you'd value? There's nothing wrong with wanting to be a corporate vice president. Can you let it go? Now, sexuality is a much more difficult thing to let go. That's not going to be my thing. But what about people who are married to people who go mad or become deeply ill? You see, we have to shift our values all the time. And who doesn't know that? Wherever you work, that you have to say, well, I used to value this, but it's the who moved my cheese principle, right? Now I have to value this because this corporation has changed. Are you going to be sad all the time except when your values happen to be met? Change your values. Don't change your ethics. Any questions, comments about this? It's probably the most important thing in one way that I'll say that educators should be doing. Teaching students not to cling to, for example, fun. Is fun fun? Yes, hooray for fun. Should we all value fun? Yes, we should value fun. But sometimes you have to let it go. Sorry to put the Frozen song into your head, but Tangled is a better movie anyway.
What do you think this can look like in the current system, then?
Yeah, in the current system, I would start de-emphasizing content, especially content that will not be relevant, post-8th grade content, and emphasizing content as a means to values and ethics. By the way, I'm not sure isn't that why we learned social studies anyway originally? Why did we have history class? Wasn't it to a great extent, not because we thought, man, to be a voter, you have to know about Napoleon III, but because we thought you could learn lessons that were generally applicable? I mean, no voter is going to be actually qualified to vote on foreign policy, even if they've memorized all the maps and read the newspaper. What you hope they have are a general set of values and ethics congenial to the Republic that you used history and literature and other things to inculcate in them, and that those good citizens will make good choices in the voting booths of people who can specialize in knowledge they don't have time to specialize in. I'm sorry, I feel like I just repeated why we have a republic to people who already knew that. But notice it isn't so that I can master the content. Why do we learn what we learn? Seriously. Why 8 years of math?
So that they can become the types of people who can think clearly in a mathematical way.
Yeah, I think so. And once they achieve that, we should stop teaching some people math or keep teaching people math in the way I know you do, which is part of a value-based education for those people who choose to get it. But it's mostly about mentoring with you, and you can't mentor that many people, whether you're online or otherwise. So, practical principle. No online program should be different numerically than the on-site program. So if at HBU we have 30 people max, academic pedagogy max, in Core 1, what's the max going to be in the online class? 30. And full-time teachers teach it, and they're expected to spend the same amount of time mentoring students as they would in the classroom. Now ask yourself this question: how many individual students can a faculty member mentor in one semester? Well, if you're a 4-4 load, like most Christian colleges are, and you teach 4 classes with 25 students and you assume no overlap, which is generally true in a discipline, that's 100 people. That's probably doable. Now, my daddy once told me that a pastor could handle about a church of 400 people before he had to split. But notice that meant you kept those people for years and got to know them. So I'm guessing much more than 100 becomes very difficult. Now think about high school, where a teacher might have 7 preps with 35 students in a class. Mentoring can't take place there. Is it any wonder we don't talk about it meaningfully? She can't possibly get to know those students well enough to make her class mentoring centered. It will almost always become content centered, objective centered. Pause again. Imagine that you graduated from high school reading well, writing well, thinking well, being numerate, and had good values. Would you be better off than the student with mad skills? I think so. And my suggestion is you can't do both. There's not time. There's the myth of the tech-savvy students. I already talked about that. I actually find that if students have to think about tech at all, they quit using it. They become frustrated, whereas people my age, 50 years old, will actually poke around with technology until they get it to work.
Like our kids.
Yeah. I mean, my kids are exactly like this. If I hand them a piece of tech and they have to read a manual or it doesn't immediately do what it appears to do, they quit. This is why the iPad was so remarkable. Many people who wouldn't use email and wouldn't use Facebook and wouldn't use laptops became involved in the computer revolution, including young adults, because they didn't have to know much about the technology. What did you do to make Facebook work? Hit it. Notice fingerprint analysis is going to even cause you to avoid having to remember your name and password, which is a big frustration for many under 18-year-olds. They can't remember all those passwords. So what do they pick? Password, 1, 2, 3, 4 on all their accounts. Or one thing for all their accounts, no matter how many people tell them it isn't safe. Okay, merit based on content, discipleship on values. Merit-based education where? Content. Higher education is discipleship based on values. Now, I've said a lot about that, so I'm going to move on. Any questions about this big idea? Or comments or screams of agony or what in the world? You're going to go back to your K through 12 or college and work more and more on devaluing content with class time and trying to set that up in a merit-based way, and more about discipleship for values.
What are some small steps? I mean, I have 320 students signed up for my class next semester for 3 sections.
Yeah, schools like HBU and Biola, first of all, have to make a plan to get you from 320 students to 100. That cannot be done overnight. No one has the funding to do that. I certainly don't have the funding to do that. But we have to set it as an objective. Because we have to recognize that right now, my fear is that college is paid for, the people who do get mentored, by the people who don't know to care. So if you have 50 kids in your classroom, why can't 40 of them sue and say, come on, it can't be a good idea. You're getting government money indirectly through student aid. This can't be a good idea. The system depends on the fact that, let's say 35 of the students, Matt, are never going to ask you anything. Because no harm, no foul. If they can move roughly at the speed you're going and master the content, you'll give them their merit badge. Notice we are merit-based on content. And then the 15 kids that actually bother to talk to you get mentored. Well, you can probably handle 15 times 4. Now, there are plenty of provosts that would just tell you that flat out. That's how they make it. Hey, good news. Most kids don't want what you're talking about, Reynolds. Well, why are we designing a classroom structure around what most kids want when we know that all kids would benefit if they sat with Matt to learn math? He might seduce them into learning something better, right? I suppose that's a bad word to use, but encourage, enable, make them think math is better than they've ever thought it was before. So we need, first of all, an objective plan to get there. Generally, that will also mean, second, eliminating part-time employees from all but outside voices. Maybe 10% of faculty in higher education. In high school, we have to step back and say, Somebody can yell at me in a minute. If I can't pass the finals in my colleagues' classes, what are we doing? And achieve the goal of our content and our educators having good high school educations while they're teaching. In other words, can the theater teacher pass the calculus exam? If she can't or he can't, why are you telling the kids to? Can the lit teacher pass the history exam? Then her students are required to. That's a small step. Trust me, the minute we get there, the amount of content will decrease because teachers will understand what they can do. And the amount of mentoring will go up because they'll need it. That is one change that I think could be made in any high school because it's very difficult to argue against. You're telling high school graduates that they have to know this stuff to succeed in life, but you don't know it at a high school level.
And they don't know that either.
True.
They actually get anxious about that. They realize that what they're learning in school
Goes in and out.
goes in and out.
Yeah, it's what I learned in 10th grade social studies. I got an A in that class. I only taught the brightest and best here at Biola, top 5% in the U.S. And I had students that thought World War II came before World War I and that we were counting down. World War II, World War I, Armageddon. Now, I want to say, these public school students, it isn't because they had bad schools or bad teachers. They had high SATs, and I'm sure they were told the truth in a class and got an A. But what? Information overload. It's the school that makes you read Kafka overnight and then have a discussion about it and moves on to the next book. That's okay in college, but not okay in high school. But notice if I run a high school like that, I feel good about myself. Now the question is, if you made the math teacher come in and read Kafka overnight, plus learn math, you'd start to get like real world sense of how much content is necessary. Now notice, the only reason some of you think, man, we couldn't change, is why? Colleges would get mad at us. And that's never a good reason, right? We have a self-perpetuating system. It's like English PhD programs that know there are no jobs in English, but have to keep creating English PhDs. Why? They'd lose their jobs otherwise. Even though the odds of getting an English job from most schools, we're talking about Harvard here, might be akin to playing in the NBA. If you come to HBU, we have a Division I football team. We'll play schools like the U of H. And you think you're going to play in the NFL, we have ripped you off. If you come because you want to play 4 more years of competitive football and have a good time while you get a free education, that is awesome. Same thing with our English majors. Do we produce people that love what we love, but they have no chance of doing it the way we did? Because the world has changed. We don't need as many of us as we used to. Next. This is where it's a little sad, right?
Can I go back to the mentoring?
Yeah, please.
I'm just trying to think this through. I have students come to me that I'll start mentoring relationships with, but I'm just thinking right now, I need to get more of them engaged. How do you kind of set that up? I mean, do you keep reminding them class after class, hey, I'm here to go deeper with you? Or,
Yeah, I mean, let me be simple-minded. By mostly having discussion-based classes, by taking the emphasis off content, understanding that, one, you all have to go read the Iliad, and that will be good because that's what we're going to discuss, but we're not reading it because I expect you to remember who Diomedes is. I all the time meet Torrey graduates, and they think I'm going to give them a quiz on the Iliad. I've actually met graduates that I think go to Wikipedia, look up details of the Republic so they can remember who Glaucon is. Now, I really care who Glaucon is because I have a PhD in Plato and think about it all the time and have to teach it every semester. But notice, what teacher actually cares if their kid who read the Republic with them in a deep seminar where we talked about real life using the Republic as a means to do it, cares that their 40-year-old former student can't remember the details of the Republic when they're an accountant? I'll guarantee you that's not what they remember fondly about my class anyway.
Okay, so you're talking about mentoring within the class as discussions. And
Yes.
come up as opposed to one-on-one mentoring outside.
But I'm also saying that schools have to be more and more structured so you can do more and more of that, where, like C.S. Lewis sitting with Sheldon Van Auken in his office, you're reading the kid's paper and responding to him or her. Now, the second I say that, everyone's, well, we can't afford that. Then we're not doing then we can't afford you now. Because right now we're flushing content into people's heads in a 30-person class no one believes they will recall. And we do it through vague platitudes like what? If you once thought about Napoleon, it'll lurk around in the background somewhere. I don't see any evidence of that. I have former students who are in their 40s. I see no evidence that the content is lurking around somewhere, and if I poked hard enough, I would uncover it. What I do uncover is a love of learning that I might have inculcated in them, a curiosity, a set of basic skills that probably their K through 8 teachers inculcated in them. They read well, write well, think well, and have good values. It's so modest, right, what we're here to do. Now notice I'm not talking about job training here. If you're in a job training profession, that's merit-based. But I'm not sure schools are the best place to do that. I mean, maybe they are, in which case we need to become ever more merit-based and automated.
Well, it seems to me that even in those situations, you could bring as an expert real-world examples of how this plays out in business. You know, if you go out tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm basically saying stop teaching American history. Just stop. Try to give them the general scope of American history by way of mentoring, value-based discussion, original documents. I don't know. I figure by 8th grade they ought to have the timeline, and if they don't, they're never going to have it. So K through 8, I'm saying maybe is very memorize, read. My grandfather got his basic structure for how to live his life by 8th grade. And I'm suggesting most people do. So heavy content, K through 8. Okay, here's the big second deep change. The old model individualized curriculum because it had to, while standardizing delivery, credits, diploma, and 4 years. That's high school or college, right? I'm mostly focusing on high school or college because I'm not sure, there's not that big a difference between pre-World War II 1 through 8, let's leave kindergarten out of it, and current 1 through 8. For all the changes in technology and styles, 1 through 8 really seems valuable. People seem to benefit from it because they learn what? To read, basic math skills, we hope, to write in a basic and clear manner that would serve them the rest of their life, and I doubt they ever lose any of those skills. I'm suggesting the new model will standardize a curriculum while individualizing delivery so that we create a common culture. We should all read Shakespeare. Now, how I deal with you, that's different. Any thoughts about this deep change? I've talked at you so much that hopefully I don't have to explain this. But if I do, I will. How do you do this practically in a classroom? Mentally challenged students in New York State received individualized educational programs that help them achieve certain set goals that we thought could be sustained. My suggestion is that every student in your school be given an IEP, an individualized education. And that what we don't individualize, except in terms of what they can learn, like with mentally challenged students. is the curriculum. We decide what our common cultural touch points are going to be as a community, and we use those to inculcate our common values, our shared values. Now, why can't all of us begin to do that in our schools? Mostly because we're so busy using the old model. So don't be a revolutionary, and don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Do it as much as you can. Begin to think about each individual in your class and say, how can I deliver this standardized content to you in a radically individualized way, but it's the same content for everyone? Now, why does this matter so much? I think that because we individualized the curriculum 4 years marching through getting units, we created in college a plethora of majors so that students could individualize. And notice in most cases that caused students to choose badly in many, many cases. The largest majors in many schools, from Harvard all the way down to HBU, to use 2 H schools, won't be the ones that lead to jobs or are the most remarkable for transforming personalities. They're the ones where you're most likely to get an A. I get this all the time from parents. What are the largest majors in school? They raise their hand and say, oh, you're a liberal arts guy. You're going to bemoan the fact that it's ones that lead to jobs. Boy, I wish that were true. But I'll make a bet, and I haven't looked at the numbers here at Biola, computer science, and my graduates would leave with decent jobs right out of Biola, is not one of the largest majors at Biola. I'll just make a prediction. Is that about right?
That's right. It's growing, though.
Yeah. Because people are starting to say, student loan money? Now notice, majors like philosophy in school that are rigorous but often life-transforming. Philosophy is, Biola is an exception to this because it's done it well. Philosophy is often the smallest of the humanities majors because of the rigor. The easier the humanities major, now they're all impractical in one way. What do you do with a philosophy degree? Well, what do you do with a comm degree? What do you do with a history degree? Any thoughts, further thoughts about this? Individualize as much as you can, but in a new way, and try to convince your principal to let you move towards individualizing delivery as much as possible while creating a common core curriculum, 9 through 12, K through 12. The Torrey Honors Institute here at Biola is exemplary. Paul Spears is the director in this regard, in that all the students take the same curriculum, the same 60 units. But not all of them as carefully read the books, not all of them get as much content out of it. None of them get the same life lessons, and as much as possible, their mentor deals with them individually. And it's a profitable program. Could that model be applied to all students? Yeah, it could. Slowly, so we don't break the bank. Does Socratic-based discussion while reading great texts have to be the means of delivery? No. And that's a mistake Torrey students sometimes make. Notice, we're going to standardize the curriculum by doing what? Individualizing delivery. And you may have some students that just won't talk in a group of 16 people. They just don't learn that way. It's not for them. But they're probably going to have to read the Republic and think about it, because we'll standardize the curriculum. The means, we can live with anything. That's why online can be the same as on site in many ways, if we do this correctly. Any other thoughts, comments about this? Yeah.
Eric Sam yesterday, mentioned universal design for learning. It's a series of principles that include, basically he was talking about, you have core concepts that you're trying to teach. And
Yes.
How do students learn and master those concepts? Well, you can vary that as much as you want. Do you watch my videos? Do you watch somebody else's videos? Do you read Wikipedia videos? And then, how do you demonstrate mastery of it? Well, you can have lots of different options for that. And that's the kind of model that Aaron.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And what that means is, I want to say, if anybody has liberal arts credibility, I must. I spent my entire life specializing in general education. We have to radically reduce the content expectations. One thing we've done, see, is to provide rigor. We just add more and more stuff that you have to know. Well, there's more and more stuff to know, but notice no kid could possibly keep up with that. I sometimes get told that. Wow, well, compared to when your grandfather was little, there's way more to know. Yeah, there's so much more to know, you might as well give up on it. That's why God invented Google, so that you wouldn't have to carry it around. But why does my daddy use Google and Facebook better than my students? Because he reads well, writes well, thinks well, and knows how to form questions to ask Google. And now my legally blind dad, sitting in his armchair, has access to the world of content, but has the right values not to abuse it. Negative side, and the right mental capacity to use it when he needs it with well-formed questions. He knows when he's reading nonsense. He knows credible sites from not credible sites generally. Yeah, you get fooled and you end up having to be snoped. I've had that happen to me too. But I don't make that mistake often. Now, what I'm saying is then that's going to lead to a radical reduction in the amount of math a kid knows when they get out of college, but they'll actually know it. Here's an idea. What if everyone graduated from HBU bilingual? In a language that's underserved, like Arabic. Would they be better off if they read fewer great texts, but could read some in Arabic? I think so. Which sounds like against my life pattern, but I say, no. It's the content isn't what matters. We've used content to make sure we're not frauds. Why? Because government money got involved, and so suddenly accreditation and standards became everything. Now, there's a good side to that because education is much less let the buyer beware than buying food is. But there is a bad side to it in that content delivery is more easily measurable than values delivery. But I've never talked to a group of people who are educators, didn't agree with the general proposition that if we radically reduced content requirements and radically increased mentoring and value requirements, that our students wouldn't be better off. We used to call this being prepared for today's workplace or whatever other educational jargon. So here's the great temptation we should avoid. And I used the Twilight image of an apple instead of the apple. One, because I love Apple and the company. And two, notice my computer just ran out of power, which tells you generally what to avoid. What's the great temptation? Life is not digital. Right? Image disappears, we're still here. Power goes out, we're still having a conversation. I remember there was a hurricane. Students got very frustrated with the speed of help getting to people. Why? Because you get your phone out and you text, #Red Cross. Boom, money's there. They have to make the steel. You have to pour the concrete and let it harden. And so this is where kind of digital being enamored, could you make school utterly fun? I'm going to guess yes. I'm going to guess that we could screen all the skills and content we normally teach into a totally gamified system where people would simply not know they were in school and get treats, and they'd gradually get the content and skill. What's the problem with this? When you are dying in your nursing home of an incurable disease, that education won't do you a spit's worth of good. And education was supposed to prepare you for the one thing you know you're going to do as a student, which is die. Well, otherwise, unless you're a utopian pacifist, I'm not even talking about pacifism. Cops and soldiers are willing to die well while shortening their lives. Often. Firefighters. You have to be a pacifist. A militarist. Should anyone become a firefighter? That's a dangerous job. But we say to firefighters, what? If you die in the line of duty, you've lived a good life. But a lot less of it. Now notice, a classroom based around fun and achievements cannot possibly tell someone to be a firefighter and stop being in a classroom earning achievements. True? We should prolong our lives at all costs. Community values, hard to do in there. So let me take questions, thoughts, comments. There are two big principles. I'm a philosopher, so my job is to do it. But I also educate every day, and I try to apply these things in a school with a budget that's probably a third the size of Biola's, and a student body that's the sixth most diverse in the United States. Not amongst Christian colleges, amongst all schools in the United States. So I have to deal with the real world here. So if you have questions about how we're doing that, from online education to anything else, I'd be happy to. Partly it just matters that you think you should be doing this. And that you're not utopian and you go break the school to fix it. You make change so rapidly that nobody can keep up with it, your employees, your students, and the school goes bankrupt because parents don't trust you. That helps nobody. You become the Napster of the digital music revolution. What you want to be is iTunes. Yes, ma'am.
Question about mentoring online. So we're talking about the importance of mentoring content. Are you talking more along the lines of having the little classroom where you mentor in person, or is it different?
Yeah, actually, now this sounds counterintuitive. I met Phil Johnson through his radio show. I heard him do a radio show, a debate with a woman named Eugenie Scott, and sent him an email. And we carried on an email correspondence that mattered to, I printed it out at one point so I wouldn't lose it, and I'm glad I did, about 20 notebooks long. I would say that before I met him physically, he was my mentor. But notice he spent hundreds of hours answering my questions, talking to me, making Lord of the Rings jokes. How much was that worth? Whatever I could afford to pay. Now, I paid nothing, as a matter of fact. I was blessed. But what student looks back on their education and resents that part of the student loan that paid for their mentor or paid for job skills that they directly use every day? I've never met a student who's bothered by either thing. What do they strongly suspect? Most of their student money went to things they didn't want, didn't use, and aren't currently using. And they might be right. They're naive often, though, too. I'm about as lean a place. HBU is the first place I've ever worked where it would be impossible for us to lay off admins. The entire provost's office has 2 admins to serve over 3,000 students. It's not like we're tiny, right? We have 2 admins. So there's not a lot of fat to cut there administratively, unless you got rid of the provost, who is a fat head. But, there isn't. But so students sometimes have a false perception, man, if we fired all the secretaries, why do I pay for that? As if secretaries don't do work. So leaving that aside, I think students rightly feel like they didn't want a lot of what they had to do, and they don't see any value in it after they do it successfully. Very rare to meet a Tory student, for example, here at Biola, or an MA philosophy student to pick a totally different program, or a nursing student who reports that about, or a film student who reports that about those programs. And what do you see? They're heavy mentoring programs that often lead to direct job skills. That's a good question. Any other questions about this? Can be done, in other words. And it can be done K through 12. Because mostly K through 8 doesn't have to change, if I'm right. What should you make 8th graders ready to do? Well, recognizing that in our culture they're still children. And maturation-wise, psychology says they are. In theory, they should be able to be adults, skills-wise. If they never picked up any more skills, they should be able to survive. They should have the right values, too. Because I suspect that's what they retain, is K through 8. The content of K through 8. Any other questions, comments? I know we're pushing noon here in a couple minutes.
You talked about values being different from ethics. And ethics.
Yes, and it's a mistake Christian colleges and schools often make. They confuse their values, for example, subjective things like modesty, with ethics. So you often have schools with highly detailed dress codes to enforce modesty, which is a culturally relative thing. Instead of teaching students the objective value of beauty and how to subjectively dress modestly depending on the culture that they're in. Remember, modesty is more like my covering for your sin, which I really, in a perfect world, shouldn't have to do at all. So it should never be the emphasis of our education. So this confusion even affects Christian colleges and schools. If I go to a Christian school and say I'm going to talk about beauty, everyone thinks I'm going to talk about modesty. I promise. Yes, go ahead.
So looking at values differently, how do we understand what the values are for a certain time and understand the changing?
Well, I mean, the good news is sociologists can tell us, but you ought to know your students well enough to know what their values are. What's the problem with a survey about millennials? My kids are never included. So you may teach at a school like Biola or like HBU, where the values of the majority are not very much like the values of the students you're teaching at all. How do you get to know their values? By mentoring them. And what you want to create are, you want to get rid of dysfunctional values while telling them, look, I mean, it's not a sin that you value this. It isn't. It isn't a sin. Value, but you're going to have to, you should also be able to value this other thing because this might not work out for you. You have to be more flexible in your values. Now, there are some values you may have to say to a student, unless the world changes, you're going to have to not have this value. Some of you, though, will have students, what if you're teaching a billionaire's kid? You'll notice that the values that they can maintain and should maintain will be entirely different than if you're teaching a Reynolds kid with no trust fund to fall back on. Did I say the ethics would be relative? Should everyone be charitable? Yes. But lessons of charity to a Reynolds are going to be different than lessons of charity, I'll make up a family name, to a Rockefeller. So that's where we have to individualize it. And you're going to have to say something like this. You really value this. I'll tell you what I really value. I don't run, as you're seeing, because I just ran 2 minutes over, on wristwatch time. My students don't even have wristwatches. They have phones. Notice phones make it even worse because now we all have the same time. We don't even get the generosity that we're all wearing different watches. And so it's 12:02. This class is 2 minutes over. Now, here's what I have to succumb to. I have to end this because all of us live in a world where I must stop. Because other things, I can't be selfish, will start falling apart if I don't. Yet, I have a value for timelessness. What did a mentor have to tell me? Boy, nothing wrong with that. That's going to be really valuable to you in circumstance A, B, and C. Whenever you can do that, you go right ahead. That might even be useful to you. Students may even love it. But I've had to tell my admin, here's your problem. Any meeting I'm in is the only meeting I have all day. You've got to walk in and stop it. Just like we have to stop this class. Blessings.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.